Make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications, and then share this video on social media with friends and parishioners. In sharing this and other videos of Ubi Petris, you become an invaluable asset in helping to spread the message of Orthodox Christianity. For the full video, please head to our Subscribe Star page, which is linked in the video description below. On July 25, 1968, Pope Paul VI, the same pope who gleefully ransacked the traditional Latin Mass and replaced it with what is essentially a Lutheran Sunday service, issued the encyclical Humanae Vitae. The encyclical came after roughly a century of debate on the topic of contraception. Now, there are several key passages in Humanae Vitae. First, couples are allowed to space out their children. Quote, with regard to physical, economic, psychological, and social conditions, responsible parenthood is exercised by those who prudently and generously decide to have more children, and by those who, for serious reasons and with due respect to moral precepts, decide not to have additional children for either a certain or an indefinite period of time. End quote. Second, it states that sex which is infertile due to causes of nature is acceptable. Quote, the sexual activity in which husband and wife are intimately and chastely united with one another, through which human life is transmitted, is, as the recent council recalled, noble and worthy. It does not, moreover, cease to be legitimate even when, for reasons independent of their will, it is foreseen to be infertile. For its natural adaptation to the expression and strengthening of the union of husband and wife is not thereby suppressed. The fact is, as experience shows, that new life is not the result of each and every act of sexual intercourse. God has wisely ordered laws of nature and the incidence of fertility in such a way that successive births are already naturally spaced through the inherent operation of these laws. The Church, nevertheless, in urging men to the observance of the precepts of the natural law, which it interprets by its constant doctrine, teaches that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. End quote. The encyclical states that sex has two purposes, both for procreation and for the strengthening of the bond between husband and wife. Quote, the reason is that the fundamental nature of the marriage act, while uniting husband and wife in the closest intimacy, also renders them capable of generating new life, and this is as a result of laws written into the actual nature of man and of woman. And if each of these essential qualities, the unitive and the procreative, is preserved, the use of marriage fully retains its sense of true mutual love and its ordination to the supreme responsibility of parenthood to which man is called. End quote. In light of Chapter 11, Chapter 13 can be understood to condemn artificial birth control. Quote, they must also recognize that an act of mutual love which impairs the capacity to transmit life, which God the Creator, through specific laws, has built into it, frustrates His design, which constitutes the norm of marriage, and contradicts the will of the author of life. Hence, to use this divine gift while depriving it, even if only partially, of its meaning and purpose, is equally repugnant to the nature of man and of woman, and is consequently in opposition to the plan of God and His holy will. End quote. Chapter 14 contains a more direct condemnation of sex which is infertile due to non-natural means. Quote, we are obliged once more to declare that the direct interruption of the generative process already begun and, above all direct abortion, even for therapeutic reasons, are to be absolutely excluded as lawful means of regulating the number of children. Equally to be condemned, as the magisterium of the Church has affirmed on many occasions, is direct sterilization, whether of the man or of the woman, whether permanent or temporary. Similarly, excluded is any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation, whether as an end or as a means. End quote. At the same time, there is this fairly odd section in which the contraceptive aspect of artificial contraception is allowed if it is merely the byproduct of a medical treatment for a different health issue and the intention is not to prohibit birth by its usage. Quote, on the other hand, the Church does not consider at all illicit the use of those therapeutic means necessary to cure bodily diseases, even if a foreseeable impediment to procreation should result therefrom, provided such impediment is not directly intended for any motive whatsoever. End quote. It leaves one wondering how evil is contraception if it can be benefited from so long as the intent is not there. So the issue seems to come down not so much to the act itself as the intent behind taking contraception. This is ironic because in chapter 20 of Humanae Vitae, it specifically allows one to use infertile periods to gain the same end result, no children. Quote, if therefore there are well-grounded reasons for spacing births, arising from the physical or psychological condition of husband or wife, or from external circumstances, the Church teaches that married people may then take advantage of the natural cycles imminent in the reproductive system and engage in marital intercourse only during those times that are infertile, thus controlling birth in a way which does not in the least offend the moral principles which we have just explained. End quote. If the sin of contraception is not in its use per se, but in the intent behind its use, that being the intent is to avoid pregnancy, then there appears to be little, if any, reason why sex during infertile periods should be allowed. In fact, and we will delve into this shortly, having sex during infertile periods was forbidden by those church fathers who commented on it. But Humanae Vitae skirts this issue by mentioning it without actually addressing it. Quote, neither the Church nor her doctrine is inconsistent when she considers it lawful for married people to take advantage of the infertile period, but condemns as always unlawful the use of means which directly prevent conception, even when the reasons given for the later practice may appear to be upright and serious. In reality, these two cases are completely different. In the former, the married couple rightly use a faculty provided to them by nature. In the latter, they obstruct the natural development of the generative process. It cannot be denied that in each case the married couple, for acceptable reasons, are both perfectly clear in their intention to avoid children and wish to make sure that none will result. But it is equally true that it is exclusively in the former case that husband and wife are ready to abstain from intercourse during the fertile period, as often as for reasonable motives the birth of another child is not desirable. And when the infertile period recurs, they use their married intimacy to express their mutual love and safeguard their fidelity towards one another. End quote. In other words, a married couple, so long as they abstain from sex during fertile periods, are welcome to indulge during infertile periods, whether those be the majority of the month, or during pregnancy, or extending out lactation, as women are largely infertile, especially for the first 6 months while breastfeeding. And this is the main problem with NFP and Humanae Vitae. It falsely claims it is carrying on the teachings of the church tradition while simultaneously ignoring not simply the witness, but also the rationale used by those church fathers who rejected contraception. Humanae Vitae also makes this rather odd claim, quote, responsible men can become more deeply convinced of the truth of the doctrine laid down by the church on this issue if they reflect on the consequences of methods and plans for artificial birth control. Let them first consider how easily this course of action could open wide the way for marital infidelity and a general lowering of moral standards. Not much experience is needed to be fully aware of human weakness and to understand that human beings, and especially the young, who are so exposed to temptation, need incentives to keep the moral law, and it is an evil thing to make it easy for them to break that law. Another effect that gives cause for alarm is that a man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman and, disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as his partner, whom he should surround with care and affection. End quote. Judging by the fact that sex slavery is at an all-time low in the developed world, and that prostitution is no more common now than during the American Civil War, the Middle Ages, or during the Golden Age of the Roman Empire, the prediction is inaccurate as it reflects a highly idealized and heavily sanitized reading of history. But Humanae Vitae was not stating anything new in terms of Catholic teaching on contraception, as Pope Pius XI had published the encyclical Casti Connubii in 1930. In the 59th chapter, it states, quote, "Holy Church knows well that, not infrequently, one of the parties is sinned against rather than sinning, when for a grave cause he or she reluctantly allows the perversion of the right order. In such a case, there is no sin, provided that, mindful of the law of charity, he or she does not neglect to seek to dissuade and to deter the partner from sin. Nor are those considered as acting against nature who in the married state use their right in the proper manner, although on account of natural reasons, either of time or of certain defects, new life cannot be brought forth. For in matrimony as well as in the use of matrimonial rites, there are also secondary ends, such as mutual aid, the cultivating of mutual love, and the quieting of concupiscence, which husband and wife are not forbidden to consider so long as they are subordinated to the primary end and so long as the intrinsic nature of the act is preserved." End quote. So we see even in 1930, the Catholic Church was officially advocating for what has been commonly termed natural family planning. Prior to this, Vatican teaching on contraception was sparse. In fact, even Casti Connubii was so vague that Humanae Vitae had to be issued nearly 4 decades later. Now, it is often pointed out that various Orthodox Christian hierarchs praised Humanae Vitae, and this is true, but that does not mean that it reflects our dogma on the issue, or even that we have a teaching on it, as most, if not all, of these hierarchs were speaking unofficially. In fact, a number of years ago, a famous Orthodox cleric and author in the English-speaking world, and we will not name him out of respect, authored a pamphlet on contraception, and in it he claimed our church has a teaching on it, and that the teaching is in accordance with Humanae Vitae, which, he claimed, followed the Patristic consensus. None of those are correct, not even remotely. The fact of the matter is, we do not, nor have we ever, had anything akin to an official universal teaching on it, but rather various conflicting rulings from local synods. Further, as we will delve into this shortly, Humanae Vitae lacked patristic support, which is why it primarily utilized scholastic natural law theory, not patristic witness. Considering the plenitude of canons addressing abortion, suicide, homicide, and euthanasia over the centuries, while simultaneously knowing that contraceptive techniques were one of, if not the most popular categories of medical knowledge passed on in the ancient world, one would expect that conciliar literature, in the form of canons, would have at least addressed the topic of contraception. But the closest thing to it is a forgery by St. Martin of Braga in the 6th century. In those authors who do not comment on contraception, most of them state outright that sex is purely for the purpose of procreation. We see this with St. Justin Martyr, quote, "But whether we marry, it is only that we may bring up children, or whether we decline marriage, we live continently." End quote. This is echoed again by St. Athenagoras of Athens, quote, "Therefore, having the hope of eternal life, we despise the things of this life, even to the pleasures of the soul, each of us reckoning her his wife whom he has married according to the laws laid down by us, and that only for the purpose of having children. For as the husbandman, throwing the seed into the ground, awaits the harvest, not sowing more upon it, so to us the procreation of children is the measure of our indulgence in appetite." End quote. Clement of Alexandria lays it out quite directly when he writes, quote, "That the law intended husbands to cohabit with their wives with self-control, and only for the purpose of begetting children, is evident from the prohibition which forbids the unmarried man from having immediate sexual relations with a captive woman. If the man has conceived a desire for her, he is directed to mourn for 30 days while she is to have her hair cut. If after this the desire has not passed off, then they may proceed to beget children, because the appointed period enables the overwhelming impulse to be tested and to become a rational act of will. End quote. In another famous work of his, known as Pedagogus, or The Instructor, it was considered so explicit that large swaths of it were initially not translated into English. Clement repeats this writing, quote, "Why, even unreasoning beasts know enough not to mate at certain times. To indulge in intercourse without intending children is to outrage nature, whom we should take as our instructor." End quote. Moving on to Clement's famed and highly respected student, Origen of Alexandria, despite later being condemned, he expresses a belief consonant with other writers in this collection. Quote, "There is no one who does not know that this member, in which the foreskin is seen to be, serves the natural functions of coitus and procreation. If anyone, therefore, is not troublesome in respect to impulses of this kind, nor exceeds the bounds set by the laws, nor has known a woman other than his lawful wife, and, in the case of her also, makes use of her in the determined and lawful times for the sake of posterity alone, that man is said to be circumcised in the foreskin of his flesh." End quote. Lactantius, more commonly known as the Christian Cicero, for his eloquent Latin, states, quote, "For they are pleasure lovers when they mate with their wives, not to procreate children and perpetuate the race, but like pigs and goats in quest of the enjoyment which such intercourse gives." End quote. Saint Epiphanius of Salamis, commenting on a Gnostic group he encountered in his youth, castigates them for their misuse of sex. Quote, "They exercise genital acts, yet prevent the conceiving of children. Not in order to produce offspring, but to satisfy lust, are they eager for corruption." End quote. These are guilty of satisfying lusts because of their desire for sex is not specifically aimed at producing children. Being, quote, "open to life" is not enough for him or any of the writers mentioned so far. Instead, one must specifically intend to have children in order for sex to be justified. The same line of thought is found in the Didascalia from late 4th or early 5th century Syria, quote, "And fornication is the destruction of one's own flesh, not being made use of for the procreation of children, but entirely for the sake of pleasure, which is a mark of incontinence, and not a sign of virtue." End quote. We have St. Augustine of Hippo, who, when writing against the Manichaeans and pointing out their aversion to childbearing, writes, quote, "The doctrine that the production of children is an evil directly opposes the next precept, 'You shall not commit adultery.' For those who believe this doctrine, in order that their wives may not conceive, are led to commit adultery even in marriage. They take wives, as the law declares, for the procreation of children, but from this erroneous fear of polluting the substance of the deity, their intercourse with their wives is not of a lawful character, and the production of children, which is the proper end of marriage, they seek to avoid. As the apostle long ago predicted of you, you indeed forbid to marry, for you seek to destroy the purpose of marriage. Your doctrine turns marriage into an adulterous connection, and the bedchamber into a brothel." End quote. In fact, in his work on the good of marriage, St. Augustine repeatedly argues that sex which does not explicitly intend to create children is a venial or pardonable sin that can be expiated via extra almsgiving. He states it outright so many times that only a few examples will suffice. Quote, "For intercourse of marriage, for the sake of begetting, has not fault, but for the satisfying of lust, but yet, with husband or wife, by the reason of the faith of the bed, it has venial fault. But adultery or fornication has deadly fault, and, through this, continence from all intercourse is indeed better even than the intercourse of marriage itself, which takes place for the sake of begetting. But because that continence is of a larger desert, but to pay the due marriage is no crime, but to demand it beyond the necessity of begetting is a venial fault. But to commit fornication or adultery is a crime to be punished. Charity of the marriage ought to beware, lest while it seek for itself occasion of larger honor, it do that for its partner which cause condemnation." End quote. St. Augustine continues later on, quote, Nor let them on this account think themselves better than the first holy fathers, who used marriage, so to speak, after the fashion of marriage. Forsooth, the use of it is such as that, if in it there has taken place through carnal intercourse anything which exceeds necessity of begetting, although in a way that deserves pardon, there is pollution. For what does pardon expiate, if that advance cause no pollution whatever? End quote. At another point, St. Augustine castigates women who approach their husbands for sex without the intent of procreation, by stating that they are worse than a concubine who is faithful to her man and desires children when she has sex. Quote, for, if a man should take unto him any one for a time, until he find another worthy either of his honors or of his means, to marry as his compeer, in his soul itself he is an adulterer, and that not with her whom he is desirous of finding, but with her with whom he so lies, as not to have with her the partnership of a husband. When she also herself, knowing and willing this, certainly acts unchastely in having intercourse with him, with whom she has not the compact of a wife. However, if she keep to him faith of bed, and after he shall have married, have no thought of marriage herself, and prepare to contain herself altogether from any such work, perhaps I should not dare lightly to call her an adulteress. But who shall say that she sins not, when he is aware that she has intercourse with a man, not being his wife? But further, if from that intercourse, so far as pertains to herself, she has no wish but for sons, and suffers unwilling whatever she suffers beyond the cause of begetting, there are many matrons to whom she is to be preferred, who, although they are not adulteresses, yet force their husbands, for the most part also wishing to exercise continence, to pay the due of the flesh, not through desire of children, but through glow of lust, making an intemperate use of their very right. In whose marriages, however, this very thing that they are married is a good. For this purpose are they married, that the lust being brought under a lawful bond should not float at large without form and loose, having of itself weakness of flesh that cannot be curbed, but of marriage fellowship of faith that cannot be dissolved, of itself encroachment of immoderate intercourse, of marriage a way of chastely begetting. For, although it be shameful to wish to use a husband for purposes of lust, yet it is honorable to be unwilling to have intercourse save with an husband, and not to give birth to children save from a husband. There are also men incontinent to that degree, that they spare not their wives even when pregnant. Therefore, whatever that is immodest, shameless, base, married persons do with one another, is the sin of the persons, not the fault of the marriage. End quote. Now, lest anyone accuse us of being alone in this understanding, we have the Catholic writer and 9th District Judge and scholar John T. Noonan. His work, Contraception, is considered the standard work on the topic of contraception in the history of Christian thought, and he agrees, stating, quote, pure Augustinian doctrine stated that only a procreative purpose freed marital intercourse from sin. Intercourse, to avoid committing fornication, was venial sin. This position, established in the 12th century with only a few dissents, was reaffirmed by the classical canonists and theologians of the 13th century. The most influential of all, St. Thomas, took this stand in his work On the Sentences. End quote. So not only does Augustine's influence spread to Aquinas later, but we also see it in other prominent Christian thinkers, such as the prolific St. Caesarius of Arles, whose massive register of sermons has come down to us in 3 volumes. Quote, in fact, a good Christian should not only observe chastity for a few days before he communicates, but he should never know his wife except from the desire for children. A man takes a wife for the procreation of children, not for the sake of lust. Even the marriage rite mentions this, for the procreation of children, it says. Notice that it does not say for the sake of lust, but for the procreation of children. I would like to know, dearly beloved, what kind of a harvest a man could gather if he sowed his field in 1 year as often as he is overcome by dissipation and abuses his wife without any desire for children. If those who are unwilling to control themselves plowed and sowed repeatedly their land which was already sown, let us see in what kind of fruit they would rejoice. As you well know, no land can produce proper fruit if it is sown frequently in 1 year. Why then does a man do with his body what he does not want done with his field? End quote. Pope St. Gregory the Great, also adopting the views of St. Augustine, is outspoken in his view that sex is purely for the procreation of offspring and that the pleasure of sex is what makes it sinful. Quote, husbands and wives are to be admonished to remember that they are joined together for the sake of producing offspring, and when, giving themselves to immoderate intercourse, they transfer the occasion of procreation to the service of pleasure, to consider that, though they go not outside wedlock, yet in wedlock itself they exceed the just dues of wedlock. Whence it is needful that by frequent supplications they do away their having fouled with the admixture of pleasure the fair form of conjugal union. For hence, it is that the apostle, skilled in heavenly medicine, did not so much lay down a course of life for the whole as point out remedies to the weak when he said, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But on account of fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. For in that he premised the fear of fornication. He surely did not give a precept to such as were standing, but pointed out the bed to such as were falling, lest haply they should tumble to the ground. Whence to such as were still weak, he added, let the husband render unto the wife her due, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. And, while in the most honorable estate of matrimony, allowing to them something of pleasure, he added, but this I say by way of indulgence, not by way of command. Now where indulgence is spoken of, a fault is implied, but one that is more readily remitted in it, that it consists not in doing what is unlawful, but in not keeping what is lawful under control. To wit, when the married have intercourse with each other, even incontinently, they still avoid lapse into sin, and are still saved through mercy. For they find as it were a little city, wherein to be protected from the fire, since this married life is not indeed marvelous for virtue, but yet is secure from punishment. End quote. But regardless of how clear these statements are, those defending Humanae Vitae will argue that these quotations only forbid sex, that it is, quote, not open to life. Now, this phrase is usually misunderstood to mean that one is doing nothing to hinder conception, or is at least using the least obstructive method possible to control fertility. When this is misunderstood, opponents will typically bring up the fact that, over the course of a year, a couple using condoms according to the manufacturer's directions typically has around a 3% rate of becoming pregnant, while, with the most effective forms of natural family planning, and there are various forms of it, generally claim that the number drops down to as little as 0.3 or 0.2% rate. But that is a straw man, as the phrase, open to life, does not refer to that. As Noonan points out, quote, the temperature method of regulating conception is not any more natural and not any less of a human intervention to produce sterile intercourse than other methods. All methods of having intercourse without conception depend on human intelligence and are artificial. What the encyclical Humanae Vitae condemns is not the artificial, nor the intelligent, nor the prudent and the human, but the deliberately willed disassociation between the conjugal act and the natural rhythm of fertility. No such disassociation is intended here. End quote. In other words, according to the Catholic Church's understanding of the phrase open to life, neither the procreative nor the pleasurable part of sex can be disassociated from the other. Both must be present. But this is not what these early Christian writers were stating. And so even by this standard for the phrase open to life, the Catholic Church's teaching on birth control as contained primarily in Humanae Vitae and Casti Connubii failed the patristic standard it claims to represent and defend. These ancient writers were stating that pleasure in sex is bad, and sex outside of fertile periods is sinful because sex is purely for the begetting of children. We know this because they prohibit sex during pregnancy. Quote, "For this reason, you could not point to any place in Scripture where one of the ancients approached a pregnant woman. Later, after the child is born and weaned, you might find that marriage relations of husbands and wives were resumed. You will find that Moses' father kept this principle in mind. After Aaron's birth, 3 years had passed before Moses was born. Again, the tribe of Levi observed this law of nature given by God, although they were fewer in number than any others which came into the promised land. For a tribe does not easily grow to great numbers if their men have intercourse only within the legal marriage relationship, and then wait until the end not only of pregnancy, but also of breastfeeding." End quote. In a rather long passage in his word Pedagogus, St. Clement repeats this. Quote, "In fact," he says, "do not touch anyone except your wedded wife, because she is the only one with whom it is lawful to enjoy the pleasures of the flesh, for the purpose of begetting lawful heirs. This is to share in God's own work of creation, and, in such a work, the seed ought not be wasted, nor scattered thoughtlessly, nor sown in a way it cannot grow." As an illustration of this last restriction, the same Moses forbade the Jews to approach even their own wives if they happened to be in the period of menstruation. The reason is that it is wrong to contaminate fertile seed, destined to become a human being, with corrupt matter of the body, or to allow it to be diverted from the furrow of the womb and swept away in a fetid flow of matter and excrement. He discouraged the ancient Jews also from having relations with a wife already with child. Pleasure sought for its own sake, even within the marriage bonds, is a sin and contrary both to law and to reason. Moses cautioned them, then, to keep away from their pregnant wives until they have delivered. In fact, the womb, situated just below the bladder and above the part of the intestine known as the rectum, extends its neck in between the edges of the bladder, and the outlet of this neck, by which the sperm enters, closes tight when the womb is full, opening again only when delivered of the fetus. It is only when it has become empty of its fruit that it can receive the sperm again. It is not wrong for us to name the organs of generation when God is not ashamed of their function. The womb welcomes the seed when it yearns for procreation, but it refuses the seed when intercourse is contrary to nature. That is, once impregnated, it makes immoral relations impossible by drawing its neck tight together. All its instincts, up to now aroused by loving intercourse, begin to be directed differently, absorbed in the development of the child within, cooperating with the Creator. It is wrong, indeed, to interfere with the workings of nature by indulging in the extravagances of wantonness. End quote. In his fifth homily on Genesis, Origen recounts the story of Lot and writes, quote, "Let the married women examine themselves and seek, if they approach their husbands for this reason alone, that they might receive children, and after conception desist. For those women who appear to be proven incestuous, when they have attained conception, do not later assent to copulation with a man. But some women, for we do not censure all equally, but there are some who serve passion incessantly, like animals without any distinction, whom I would not even compare to the dumb beasts. For even the beasts themselves know, when they have conceived, not to further grant opportunity to their males." End quote. So here we see it. Once conception is achieved, further sex is inappropriate because it is not for the purpose of procreation. This is also repeated by the Didascalia from the late 4th or early 5th century Syria. The Didascalia places sex during pregnancy on par with sex during menstruation. Quote, "When the natural purgations do appear in the wives, let not their husbands approach them, out of regard to the children to be begotten. For the law has forbidden it, for it says, "You shall not come near your wife when she is in her separation, nor, indeed, let them frequent their wives' company when they are with child, for they do this not for the begetting of children, but for the sake of pleasure. Now a lover of God ought not to be a lover of pleasure." End quote. St. Caesarius of Arles also forbids it, and like the Didascalia, condemns it along with sex during menstruation. Quote, "Above all, no one should know his wife when Sunday or other feasts come around. Similar precautions should be taken as often as women menstruate, for the prophet says, 'Do not come near to a menstruous woman.' If a man is aware that his wife is in this condition, but refuses to control himself on a Sunday or feast, the children who are then conceived will be born as lepers, or epileptics, or perhaps even demoniacs. Lepers are commonly born, not of wise men who observe chastity on feasts and other days, but especially of farmers who do not know how to control themselves. Truly, brethren, if animals without intellect do not touch each other except at a fixed and proper time, how much more should men who have been created according to God's image observe this? What is worse, there are some dissolute or drunken men who sometimes do not even spare their wives when they are pregnant. Therefore, if they do not amend their lives, we are to consider them worse than animals. Such men the apostle addresses when he says, 'Every one of you learn how to possess his vessel in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who have no hope.' Because what is worse, many do not observe proper chastity with their own wives. They should give abundant alms, as I said above, and forgive all their enemies. Thus, as we mentioned, what has become defiled by dissipation may be cleansed by constant almsgiving." End quote. Now, as sex during pregnancy and menstruation were forbidden due to their lack of procreative potential, it would go without saying that sex outside of fertile periods is also forbidden. This is important because natural family planning is based entirely on having sex only during infertile periods in order to avoid pregnancy. But, as Noonan points out, the first categorical condemnation of birth control listed by any saint is the very one that the Catholic Church permits, the rhythm method. Concerning the rhythm method, St. Augustine of Hippo writes, quote, "It is not you who used to counsel us to observe as much as possible the time when a woman, after her purification, is most likely to conceive, and to abstain from cohabitation at that time, lest the soul should be entangled in flesh. This proves that you approve of having a wife, not for the procreation of children, but for the gratification of passion. In marriage, as the marriage law declares, the man and woman come together for the procreation of children." End quote. Concerning this, Noonan points out the irony, writing simply, quote, "In the history of the thought of theologians on contraception, it is, no doubt, a piquant that the first pronouncement on contraception by the most influential theologian teaching on such matters should be such a vigorous attack on the one method of avoiding procreation accepted by 20th century Catholic theologians as morally lawful." End quote. This is backed up by Father Mahoney, a leading moral theologian in the Catholic Church. He writes, quote, "Thus it was that Augustine roundly condemned as a satisfaction of lust the abstaining from intercourse during fertile periods, which the Manichees had advocated as a means of avoiding the production of offspring in which spirit would be imprisoned." End quote. These are significant statements, as the influence of St. Augustine on Catholic theology cannot be understated. In fact, we will later come back to the fact that because the views in Casti Connubii and Humanae Vitae could not be justified by the standard of patristic thought, the Catholic theologians had to work from the argument of natural law instead. Because of the expressed rationale behind the prohibition on sex during pregnancy and during menstruation, it should come as no surprise that St. Augustine also condemned sex during infertile periods. As we saw earlier, he counted it as a venial sin that required extra prayer and almsgiving to atone for. Further, it would appear that sex past childbearing age is also unacceptable, or at least heavily discouraged. In a long quotation from his commentary on the Gospel of Luke, St. Ambrose of Milan states that not only should youth only have sex for the purpose of procreation, but also those who have aged past childbearing years are best off if they desist from sex due to their inability to procreate. He writes, quote, "The saints have a very great sense of modesty, so much so that they can even feel a kind of shame regarding what they have prayed for, as we see here in the case of St. Elizabeth. She certainly wanted to have children, yet she hid herself for 5 months. Why would she hide herself unless she felt some shame? The reason is that for every function, there is the appropriate and suitable time. What is becoming at one time is not becoming at another time, and difference in age quite alters a situation. Even within marriage, there is a certain period of time during which it is honorable to give birth, in the vigor of one's youth, when it is natural to expect offspring. Example shows that this is the time of life authorized for childbearing. This is the time of life when marriage is to be desired. But once a person has reached a more advanced age, an age more apt for instructing children than for giving them birth, there is a sense of shame in presenting the outward signs of a marriage that has been consummated, however honorable and legitimate that union may have been. There is, I say, a kind of shame about bearing the burden intended for a more youthful person, and carrying in the womb fruit that is out of season. Old people tend to refrain from conjugal intercourse, feeling that it is unsuited to their advanced years, and rightly fearing that they might appear to be lacking in self-control. Even young people often put forward the excuse that they want children. They think to hide the heat of their desires by protesting that they desire to have a family. If, therefore, young people blush to admit openly their passion, how much greater must be the shame that old people feel? Yet, even among the young you will find some so filled with fear of God that they are able to rule and moderate their hearts. People such as this, once they have had a family, refrain from further intercourse. Is this so surprising in human beings, seeing that even the very animals tell us silently by their example that they, once they have conceived offspring, cease to copulate? Once they feel their womb grow heavy with the seed that has been implanted in them, they give up physical intercourse. They no longer abandon themselves to passion, but devote themselves to the care of their little ones. But as for humans, they have regard neither for their children nor for God. The former they defile, and the latter they provoke to anger. Moderate your passions, therefore, by considering that your Creator's hands are at work, so to speak, fashioning a human being within the womb. He is at work, and do you dare to profane the sacred mysteries of the womb by your lust? At least imitate the animals, or have respect for God. But I need not confine my remarks to the animals. The earth itself often takes rest from the labor of bringing forth new life. And if the farmer, in overeager haste, loads it with more and more seeds, the earth punishes him for his impudence. She turns her fecundity into sterility. Therefore, the elements themselves and the beasts of the field are deterred by a natural shame from interfering with the process of gestation. Women feel that they are looked down on if they fail to produce the fruit of wedlock, seeing that the sole reason why they marry is in order to have children. All this would make one suppose that the couple had ceased to have conjugal relations. For if she had not blushed to have intercourse with an old man, she would not have blushed to bear his child. Yet we know that she did blush to find herself with child, not knowing the sacred mystery of this conception." End quote. First, in the footnotes on this passage, Noonan points out that St. Ambrose uses the term senex to describe the old, and that this term typically meant 40 or older. Second, St. Ambrose starts out with what seems like encouragement and making it merely a matter of shame, but then moves on to how it is a precept of nature that one should avoid sex during pregnancy and past childbearing years. The same logic is present in St. Clement of Alexandria. He states, quote, why even unreasoning beasts know enough not to mate at certain times. To indulge in intercourse without intending children is to outrage nature, whom we should take as our instructor. Her wise directions concerning the periods of life are meant to be obeyed. I mean that she allows us to marry at any time, but after the advent of old age and during childhood, for she does not permit the one to marry yet the other any more. End quote. The certain times St. Clement is referring to are later clarified as the advent of old age and during childhood. In other words, during childhood and also during old age, mating is prohibited, as it is incapable of conception and therefore immoral. Now, when a woman breastfeeds, especially for the first 6 months, only rarely will she conceive, as women typically stop ovulating during that period. For that reason, we find Pope St. Gregory the Great forbidding sexual intercourse until the child is weaned. He writes, quote, "Further, her husband ought not to cohabit with her till that which is brought forth be weaned. But an evil custom has arisen in the ways of married persons, that women scorn to nurse the children whom they bring forth, and deliver them to other women to be nursed, which custom appears to have been devised for the sole cause of incontinency, in that, being unwilling to contain themselves, they think scorn to suckle their offspring. Those women, therefore, who, after an evil custom, deliver their children to others to be nursed, ought not to have intercourse with their husbands unless the time of their purification has passed, seeing that, even without the reason of childbirth, they are forbidden to have intercourse with their husbands while held of their accustomed sicknesses, so much so that the sacred law smites with death any man who shall go into a woman having her sickness." End quote. At the end of the 9th century, the Khan of the Bulgars, Boris, wrote a letter to Pope Nicholas with a list of questions about Christianity. One of those questions was in regard to whether or not women could have sex before weaning their child. Pope Nicholas replied in the negative, and then quotes Pope St. Gregory the Great on the topic. Quote, "For how many days after a woman gives birth to a child a man should abstain from her is stated not by our opinions, but in the words of the Roman Pope and Apostle of the English nation, Gregory of blessed memory, who, when he writes to Bishop Augustine, whom he had sent to Saxony, says, among other things, a woman's husband should not approach to lie with her until the infants, to whom she has given birth, have been weaned. But a depraved custom has arisen in the behavior of married people, that women, despite nursing the children whom they have borne, and hand them over to be nursed by other women. And this seems to have happened solely because of incontinence, since those who refuse to restrain themselves, despite nursing those to whom they have given birth." End quote. Closely linked to this is the question of appropriate positions during sex. The comments on it are sparse, but Noonan points out that the Irish penitentials condemned any position that was not the missionary position. This is rarely mentioned in other texts, but this prohibition is carried into the 2nd millennium with the scholastics. Noonan comments, quote, "An objection may be raised to this analysis of the sin against nature, since the term was also applied to departure from the fit way instituted by nature as to position. The fit way was with the woman beneath the man. Theologians following Aquinas attacked deviation from this position as unnatural and as mortal sin." End quote. In the same work, Noonan later follows this up with, quote, "The givenness of the generative process was supported by the assertion that the generative use of sexuality is what nature has taught all animals. Yet the scholastics, like the fathers, appealed to animal behavior only selectively to confirm views already held. Where the natural posture in intercourse is at issue, human behavior is contrasted with animal behavior, and animal becomes a dirty word." End quote. Surprisingly, coitus interruptus, more commonly referred to as the, quote, pull-out method, was rarely mentioned. Unsurprisingly, when it was condemned. It appears that only Saints Epiphanius of Salome, Jerome, and Augustine of Hippo condemn it outright, But as Noonan points out, it was mentioned by hardly anyone in relation to Genesis chapter 38, where the story of Onan is told. Even in the Irish penitentials, known for their severity in regard to sexual sins, it's never mentioned. Quote, in over 100 quotations from the Bible in the various Irish penitentials, there is no citation of Genesis 38. The greatest scriptural scholar of Anglo-Saxon England, Bede, made no reference to marriage in his commentary on this text in Genesis, following instead Augustine's allegorical treatment of Onan as a type of useless human being who did not contribute what he could. The absence of more widespread allusion to Onan argues an absence of widespread use of his method of contraception. End quote. It seems odd that what was probably the most common form of birth control was left relatively unaddressed by patristic writers. It is addressed even less often than the taking of herbs and potions to procure sterility. Far more often, and we will cover this later in the video, the condemnation of herbs and potions occurs in the context of abortions and is linked with the practice of magic, or what we would now call witchcraft or voodoo. Closely tied with the topic of contraception is ensoulment. Often when patristic quotations regarding contraception are presented, they are spoken of in terms of murder, and one wonders whether abortifacients and contraceptives were distinguished. They oftentimes were, but before moving on to that topic and explaining why contraception was spoken of as murder, it is worth covering the topic of ensoulment in the patristics. The term parricide refers to the murder of a close relative in general, but specifically to the murder of a parent. St. Ambrose of Milan uses it in relation to contraception, but applies it in a way that would not qualify as murder in our understanding. Quote, even the wealthy, in order that their inheritance may not be divided among several, deny in the very womb their own progeny. By the use of parricidal mixtures, they snuff out the fruit of their wombs in the genital organs themselves. In this way, life is taken away before it is given. End quote. Notice the last line. Life is taken away before it is given. St. Caesarius of Arles also speaks of children not conceived as being murdered. Quote, is anyone unable to warn that no woman should accept a potion to prevent conception, or to condemn within herself the nature which God wanted to be fruitful? Indeed, she will be held guilty of as many murders as the number of those she might have conceived or borne, and unless suitable penance saves her, she will be condemned to eternal death and hell. If a woman does not want to bear children, she should enter upon a pious agreement with her husband, for only the abstinence of a Christian woman is chastity. End quote. Later on, in this 44th sermon, St. Caesarius repeats this line of thought that contraception is murder, stating, quote, no woman should take drugs for purposes of abortion, nor should she kill her children that have been conceived or are already born. Moreover, women should not take diabolical draughts with the purpose of not being able to conceive children. A woman who does this ought to realize that she will be guilty of as many murders as the number of children she might have borne. I would like to know whether a woman of nobility who takes deadly drugs to prevent conception wants her maids or tenants to do so. Otherwise, she may refuse to conceive children or, what is more serious, be willing to kill souls which might have been good Christians. End quote. In a sermon in which he is discussing the castration, St. John Chrysostom speaks in similar terms, describing castration in terms of murder. Quote, for this intent, therefore, he brought in those others, even that he might encourage these, since if this was not what he was establishing, what means his saying concerning the other eunuchs? But when he says that they made themselves eunuchs, he means not the excision of the members, far from it, but the putting away of wicked thoughts. Since the man who has mutilated himself, in fact, is subject even to a curse, as Paul says, I would they were even cut off which trouble you. And very reasonably, for such a one is venturing on the deeds of murderers, and giving occasion to them that slander God's creation, and opens the mouths of the Manichaeans, and is guilty of the same unlawful acts as they that mutilate themselves among the Greeks. For to cut off our members has been from the beginning a work of demoniacal agency and satanic device, that they may bring up a bad report upon the work of God, that they may mar this living creature, that imputing all not to the choice, but to the nature of our members, the more part of them may sin in security, as being irresponsible, and doubly harm this living creature, both by mutilating the members and by impeding the forwardness of the free choice on behalf of good deeds. End quote. St. Jerome is also included in this category when he writes, quote, "Some go so far as to take potions, that they may ensure barrenness, and thus murder human beings almost before their conception. Some, when they find themselves with child through their sin, use drugs to procure abortion, and when, as often happens, they die with their offspring, they enter the lower world laden with the guilt not only of adultery against Christ, but also of suicide and child murder." End quote. Notice how St. Jerome contrasts the two situations. One is contraceptive, which he defines in terms of murder, and the other is abortive, which he also defines as murder. But Noonan translates it more accurately, writing, quote, "Others, indeed, will drink sterility and murder a man not yet born." End quote. The translation from the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers collection attempted to smooth out what appears to be a contradiction, how making oneself sterile kills a man not yet born, but Noonan provides a better translation and one that makes sense in terms of ensoulment, as well as later Western canon law in regard to abortions prior to ensoulment. This becomes clearer in letter 121 of St. Jerome, in which he argues that abortion is not homicide until the human is formed. Quote, "Seeds are gradually formed in the uterus, and it is not reputed homicide until the scattered elements received their appearance and members." End quote. The issue centers around the understanding of Exodus chapter 22, verse 22. Quote, "Divergent theories apparently underlie two versions of an Old Testament verse. In Exodus chapter 21, verse 22, according to the Hebrew text, if a man accidentally causes an abortion, life is given for life, only if the mother dies. The death of a fetus is not treated like the killing of an adult human being. It seems to be supposed that the fetus is at no point a man. In the Septuagint version of Exodus chapter 21, verse 22, the text prescribes the penalty of life for life if the embryo is formed. By formed may be meant what Aristotle means. This view is adopted by Philo. A third theory appears in Tertullian. He argues that the embryo, after conception, has a soul and that it is a man when it attains its final form. Jerome's translation of the Old Testament followed the Hebrew in Exodus chapter 21, verse 22, and opened the possibility of treating the fetus as at no point of development human. The prevailing Christian understanding, however, seems to have followed the Septuagint in distinguishing between an unformed and formed stage. This view was evidently held by Jerome himself." End quote. St. Augustine also chimes in on the topic in his work, Questions on Exodus. In question 80, he straight out says abortion prior to ensoulment is not an abortion. Quote, "Here the question of the soul is usually raised, whether what is not formed can be understood to have no soul, and whether for that reason it is not homicide, because one cannot be said to be deprived of a soul if one has not yet received a soul. The argument goes on to say, but if it has been formed, he shall give soul for soul. If the embryo is still unformed, but yet in some way ensouled while unformed, the law does not provide that the act pertains to homicide, because still there cannot be said to be a live soul in a body that lacks sensation, if it is in flesh not yet formed, and thus not yet endowed with senses." End quote. But this opens the confusing situation. How could contraception be murder when one is simply prohibiting life from starting, but an abortion prior to ensoulment was not murder? This, of course, another issue in which St. Augustine is just wrong. More often than not, we hear Catholic apologists make claims like, but St. Augustine believed in the filioque, or you can't just say one half of the church was wrong on this issue. But here, we see that one half of the church could be wrong, because while the greatest theologian in the West could be fine with early-term abortions, the East was exemplified by St. Basil the Great in his famous statement that, quote, "The woman who purposely destroys her unborn child is guilty of murder. With us there is no nice inquiry as to it being formed or unformed." End quote. The Council of Trullo later repeats St. Basil in its 91st canon. The distinction St. Augustine and St. Jerome make in formed and unformed is irrelevant to the East. Life starts at conception, and the purposeful ending of that life is murder. There are no exceptions, none whatsoever, given to this judgment. What is ironic is when Catholics attempt to justify the filioque from St. Augustine, and when we rebuff it by pointing out he was wrong, the answer we usually receive is, "But the ecumenical councils called him a doctor of the church," or "Was the greatest theologian in the West wrong on such a fundamental issue?" Or, especially when they're parroting Bessarion the Apostate at Florence, they'll say, "The fathers of the church cannot contradict one another." But aside from the fact that at the time of the ecumenical councils, only St. Augustine's anti-Manichaean writings were known to the Greek East, and, therefore, that is all the councils were judging him on. No Catholic apologist would attempt to defend St. Augustine as being right in his bizarre view on predestination, or his view on early-term abortion, or even his views on ensoulment, the last of which later made it into Article 3 of the Catechism of Trent here. Quote, "But what surpasses the order of nature and human comprehension is, that as soon as the Blessed Virgin assented to the announcement of the angel in these words, 'Behold the handmaid of the Lord,' 'Be it done unto me according to thy word,' the most sacred body of Christ was immediately formed, and to it was united a rational soul enjoying the use of reason. And thus in the same instant of time he was perfect God and perfect man. That this was the astonishing and admirable work of the Holy Ghost cannot be doubted. For according to the order of nature, the rational soul is united to the body only after a certain lapse of time." End quote. This teaching on delayed ensoulment was later revoked, but this is why we have to seek the consensus of the Fathers and not individual ones. In fact, if you ignore the papal doctrines, pretty much all of the bizarre theology that has come out of the West takes its root in St. Augustine, precisely because they were not searching for a consensus. Once Aquinas started writing, Catholic theologians did the same thing with him. But even within the penitentials that were so common in the British Isles and Frankish kingdoms, the views of delayed ensoulment and semi-acceptability of early-term abortions were common. Quote, "In the penitentials, anal or oral intercourse is treated as a serious sin by everyone who mentions such behavior. Many writers prescribe a more serious penance for it than for homicide committed by a layman. Without exception, such acts are treated as more serious than the abortion of a fetus under 40 days. This discrimination suggests that protection of a life is less a motive to the authors of the penitentials than the control of lust. Why is dorsal intercourse punished at all? The patristic classics had not attacked it as sinful, and, unlike the other forms of objectionable intercourse, it did not preclude procreation. In the light of later medieval commentary, one may guess that a belief was current that it somehow impeded procreation. Hence, the light 40-day penances were assigned, with heavier penances added if procreation was habitually hindered." End quote. This came to a head in a letter by Pope Innocent III known as Sicut Ex. The situation was that a priest in the Carthusian order had a mistress whom he impregnated, and, once discovered, he assisted her in having an abortion. His abbot, on finding out, wrote to Pope Innocent III asking him if the priest was what is known canonically as irregular, meaning that he was unable to perform priestly functions. Innocent wrote back and stated that so long as the abortion was prior to ensoulment, that there was no reason to put the priest into a state of irregularity. This is very important, as in canon law then as now, a clergyman who commits homicide receives the automatic sentence of irregularity per Decretals 5.12.6. What is clear is that to Pope Innocent III, an abortion prior to ensoulment, while considered a mortal sin, was not considered homicide. So here, we see another area in which the Catholic teaching on reproduction has changed significantly. Now, in the 10th century, Regino of Prum compiled a manual for confessors, and he created a canon within it known as Si Alquis, after the first two words in it. The canon runs thus, quote, "If anyone, for the sake of satisfying sexual desire, or in deliberate hatred, does something to a man or to a woman, so that no children may be born of him or her, or gives something to drink, so that he cannot generate, or she conceive, let it be held as homicide." End quote. That statement bounced around and was included in random confessors' manuals, and did not make it into Gratian's Decretum, but in the 13th century, when Raymond of Pennyfort was tasked with creating an addendum onto the Decretum, he included Si Alquis, which made it famous. But as Noonan remarks, there was no logical consistency between Si Alquis and Sicut Ex. Either contraception was murder, in which case an abortion at any stage would be murder, or contraception wasn't murder, in which case the question on abortion as homicide could potentially go either way. Regardless, the idea that an early term abortion wasn't murder completely destroyed any rationale for forbidding contraception. Quote, "The author faced the same problem as the canonists on how to reconcile Si Alquis, holding contraception to be homicide, and Sicut Ex, holding that only abortion of a formed fetus was homicide." End quote. In fact, according to McLaren, quote, "Abortion prior to ensoulment was certainly not considered by the Church as homicide, and would not be until 1917." End quote. In other words, if Catholic apologists are correct in their assertion that the Orthodox Church has supposedly caved or given into modernism on the topic of contraception, that begs the question of how we can describe the status of the Catholic Church, which, for more than 90% of the second millennium, did not consider abortions prior to ensoulment to be homicide. This is odd, considering it was still considered a mortal sin. In fact, and in our defense, there are relatively few quotations from Church Fathers on the topic of contraception, and with the exception of one regional council in France in the 6th century that was not accepted by any larger councils from either a local or ecumenical council, no conciliar decree on the issue were ever created in the first millennium. Quote, "As no legislation against contraception had been specifically enacted by a council, the collection of conciliar canons made in the West between 450 and 550 have nothing on the subject. They contain only the canon of the Council of Ancyra on abortion. The absence of enacted law was drastically remedied by St. Martin of Braga." End quote. There was such a dearth of material on contraception that St. Martin of Braga interpolated a canon from the Council of Ancyra. Quote, "Among the canons given, he offered this deliberate expansion of the canon of Ancyra to cover contraception, and to cover its practice in marriage as well as in fornication. If any woman has fornicated and has killed the infant thence born, or has desired to commit an abortion and kill what she has conceived, or to take steps so that she may not conceive, either in adultery or in legitimate marriage, the earlier canons decreed that such women might receive communion at death. We, however, in mercy judge that such women or other women who are accomplices of their crimes should do penance for 10 years. The first apparent church legislation against contraception is thus an interpolation. Enjoying the sponsorship of a saint who also came to hold the prestigious metropolitan see of Braga, Martin's canon was accepted as the work of the Venerable 4th Century Council. The text circulated as that of Ancyra wherever Martin's collection was used, and other collections drew on Martin." End quote. Considering how widespread contraceptive tactics were in the Greco-Roman world, and considering how often we see canons against abortion and infanticide, against homosexuality, against bestiality and masturbation, and against various other sexual sins, oftentimes described in great detail, a reasonable person would expect to find similar condemnations of contraception in canonical literature, but we do not. Instead, we find scattered comments by random church fathers and patristic era writers, almost all of whom had odd views about ensoulment. Quote, "It is abundantly clear from these discussions that most anyone contends is that ensoulment occurs at conception. The dominant view is that the fetus becomes a man only when formed. The moment of formation appears to be the 40-day period set for Aristotle for males, and the 80-day period suggested by Leviticus for females. In light of such a view on the fetus, no one could have confused the seed with a man or meant to say that destruction of the seed was literal homicide." End quote. McLaren adds to this, stating, quote, "But in fact, canon law followed Augustine in holding that the embryo was besouled in the 2nd month and besexed in the 4th. What even the writings of the more conservative made clear is that they had no way of basing their condemnations of abortion on the concept of animation at the point of conception. Their condemnations were based rather on the more general argument that it was a non-procreative act." End quote. There are only a few church fathers we encountered, and, unsurprisingly, they were those who showed the least amount of influence from Stoicism, who did not demand procreation to be the primary reason for sex. One is St. John of Damascus. In Book 4, Chapter 24 of On the Orthodox Faith, the Damascene states, quote, "So that to prevent the wearing out and destruction of the race by death, marriage was devised that the race of men may be preserved through the procreation of children." End quote. In the same chapter, he elucidated on it further, stating, quote, "Good indeed is the procreation of children enjoined by the law, and good is marriage on account of fornications, for it does away with these, and by lawful intercourse does not permit the madness of desire to be inflamed into unlawful acts. Good is marriage for those who have no continence. But that virginity is better, which increases the fruitfulness of the soul and offers to God the seasonable fruit of prayer. Marriage is honorable, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge." End quote. St. John Chrysostom, though, despite his generally perceived harshness in terms of morals, actually takes a softer line and states that the main reason for marriage was to deal with lust and avoid fornication. Now, this line is echoed elsewhere, such as in Pope St. Gregory the Great, but even St. Gregory places procreation as the main reason for marriage and begrudgingly admits avoidance of fornication is a reason, but not the reason, and therefore still sides with St. Augustine in that sex without intention for children is sinful. But here we have St. John Chrysostom stating the main purpose of marriage is quenching lust. Quote, "So marriage was granted for the sake of procreation, but an even greater reason was to quench the fiery passion of our nature. Paul attests to this when he says, 'But to avoid immorality, every man should have his own wife.' He does not say, 'for the sake of procreation.' Again, he asks us to engage in marriage not to father many children, but why? So that Satan may not tempt you," he says. Later, he does not say, "if they desire children," but "if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry." End quote. Prior to St. John Chrysostom, we see St. Basil the Great stating the same thing. Marriage is a remedy against fornication. Quote, "If he improperly quotes the charge increase and multiply, I laugh at him, for not discerning the signs of the times. Second, marriage is a remedy against fornication, not a means of lasciviousness. If they cannot contain, it is said, let them marry. But if they marry, they must not break the law." End quote. So we can see that despite the overwhelming majority of Western church commentators believing that marriage was used properly only when children were directly intended, not simply being open to life, but specifically intending with each sexual act to create life, there were some voices, specifically in the East, who believed that procreation was not the primary reason for marriage and sex, but that it was rather an outlet for otherwise destructive passions. But this begs the question of why there was such a heavy emphasis on sex only for reproductive reasons in the West, while prominent figures in the East taught otherwise. And the reason is Stoicism. Quote, "Stoicism was in the air the intellectual converts to Christianity breathed, half consciously, half unconsciously. they accommodated some Christian beliefs to a Stoic sense. End quote. St. Justin, St. Clement of Alexandria, Lactantius, St. Ambrose of Milan, St. Jerome, and St. Augustine were by far the most influenced by Stoicism. But the influence of Stoicism was disproportionately high amongst the highly educated in Rome, North Africa, and Alexandria, and in the following quotation, we can recognize the strains of thought present. Quote, the Stoic approach to sexuality apparently had a particular appeal for Christian moralists. The Stoics sought to control bodily desires by reason, to the end of being rationally self-sufficient, dependent on no external force. A typical Stoic, such as Epictetus, considered immoderation in bodily activities irrational, for it made man dependent on his own body. The Stoic watchwords were nature, virtue, decorum, freedom from excess. The Christian intellectuals adopted these guides to sexuality without adopting the Stoic goal of rational self-sufficiency. Passion in marriage was a lone suspect. Marriage must have another basis. Plainly, that basis was its necessary part in the propagation of the race. By this standard of rational purposefulness, self-evident and supplied by nature, excess in marital intercourse might be measured. This view of marriage was to seem right and good to many Christians. End quote. The Stoic need for a clear purpose ensured that procreation was the sole means for sex. Quote, in the first century, the clearest formulation of Stoic marital doctrine is made by Musonius Rufus, the influential teacher in Rome of Epictetus, the younger Pliny, and a number of other Romans from the governing class. Musonius taught that marital intercourse was morally right only if its purpose was procreative. Intercourse for pleasure, within the limits of marriage, was reprehensible. His doctrine joined the Stoic distrust of pleasure and the Stoic insistence on purpose. End quote. The influence of Stoicism was not limited to Christianity, though, as the Neo-Pythagoreans also exhibited strong influence from the Stoic sexual ethic and its appeal to nature as a guide. Quote, the Neo-Pythagoreans, themselves imbued with Stoic doctrine, held the same views on marriage. It is particularly well established, says a Pythagorean treatise spuriously ascribed to Asellius Lucanus, that we have intercourse not for pleasure, but for the purpose of procreation. The sexual organs are given man not for pleasure, but for the maintenance of the species. From an originally pagan collection of gnomic wisdom came the epigram, an adulterer is also everyone who is shameless with his own wife. Symbolic of Stoic influence, the epigram, in a variation of it by St. Jerome, was destined to echo through 1,000 years of Christian writing on marriage. The prevailing doctrine in these highly respectable, morally earnest circles thus favored the restriction of sexual activity by rules of reason appealing to nature. These authors had sought a purpose for sexual activity, and they had found it in the biological function. The suspicion they felt towards affection and dependence excluded the expression of love as a purpose. The supreme norm for them was not love, but nature. End quote. So influential was Stoicism that large sections of their work were plagiarized by Christian authors. Quote, if one asks then, where the Christian fathers derived their notions on marital intercourse, notions which have no express biblical basis, the answer must be chiefly from the Stoics. In the case of such an early and influential teacher as Clement of Alexandria, the direct descent is obvious. His work on the purpose of marriage is a paraphrase of works on Musonius. In the 2nd century, Origen's standard for intercourse and pregnancy is clearly Seneca's. In the 3rd century, Lactantius's remarks on the obvious purpose of the generative faculties echo Ocellus Lucanus. In the 4th century, Jerome's most austere remarks are taken from Seneca. It is not a matter of men expressing simply truths which common sense might suggest to anyone with open eyes. It is a matter of a doctrine consciously appropriated. The descent is literary, the dependence substantial. End quote. Noonan, though, admits that there was a similitude between Stoicism and strains of thought within early Christianity on sex, and that is why early Christian writers felt so justified turning to Stoicism. Quote, to be sure, The Christian view of contraception might have been much the same if Stoicism had never existed. The Stoic doctrine on marriage would never have been received if there were not other strands of thought in the Christian community to which it was congenial. Before Clement, Origen, or Jerome, the law of nature had been invoked by St. Paul to determine sexual vice. Values in the Jewish heritage of the Christians were confirmed by the Stoic teaching. The statement that the rational use of sexual faculties is a procreative one is not the same as the Old Testament statement that fecundity is highly desirable. The ideas do, however, harmonize, and either might have been sufficient basis for rejecting contraception. But what Christian sexual doctrine would have been without the influence of Stoic teaching is a speculative construction. In fact, the Stoic view of marital intercourse, the stress on procreative purpose, the failure to connect intercourse and love were profound influences on the Christian approach. The doctrine on contraception, as it was fashioned, largely depended upon them. End quote. McLaren points out that changes within the Roman Empire made it more receptive to the Christian sexual ethics. Quote, the rational, optimistic approach to sexuality was eclipsed by more fearful views. Sexual excesses were increasingly condemned as weakening. In artistic portrayals, nudes were replaced with clothed figures. Christians did not so much create this new morality as act as its conduit. Already the Stoics had put in place a puritanical creed, and the metaphysics of the Neoplatonists and mystery cults had popularized an otherworldliness. The passions were suspect. Sexuality was regarded as necessarily pitted against reason. The attacks on the old style of life launched by the Stoics were simply continued by Christian converts. John Chrysostom, Bishop of Constantinople, was preceded in his opposition to public baths and nudity by pagan moralists. Seneca had condemned adultery because of the trouble and disorder it caused. Jerome attacked it as immoral and dangerous. Musonius Rufus and Seneca's critiques of the pursuit of sexual pleasure were followed by those of Jerome, Origen, and Clement. End quote. In other words, the Christian writers were not innovating so much as following on a trail the Stoics had already prepared beforehand. The job of the Christians was simply to expand that trail and make it mandatory. Quote, where the church was truly innovative was in making sexuality the symbol of the difference between Christians and pagans and the key indicator of individual morality. The married and the celibate, the rich and the poor, all had held up to them as a new moral common denominator, the importance of controlling sexual urges. An enormous ethical burden was now borne by acts heretofore considered hardly more significant than eating or drinking. The pagans had not been unthinking hedonists, but the idea of viewing mundane sexual practices as the privileged indicators of one's spiritual condition had previously been unthinkable. The Christians made a difference in nuance, the basis for a fundamental cultural cleavage. End quote. Noonan lays out a comprehensive summary of the various theories of conception popular in the Greco-Roman world. Quote, according to Aristotle, the male seed was the active form. The female menses provided the passive matter on which the form worked. The view was general in the Roman world that the male seed combined with the female menses to make a fetus. It is asserted by Jerome and by Augustine. It appears to be the theory of the Hellenized Jew who wrote the Book of Wisdom and of Lactantius. The theory is assumed by Clement of Alexandria. The theory in its strict Aristotelian form gives the male seed the shaping role. In the looser way in which it became popular in the classical world, the theory drops the philosophical contrast between form and matter, and the female contribution seems more important, but the male seed has a kind of supremacy. A second theory, held by many Stoics, was that the male sperm contains moisture and pneuma. In the uterus, this pneuma combines with the pneuma of the woman, so that the soul of the embryo springs from both parents, but the body only from the father's seed. A third theory omits any reference to the pneumatic contribution of the woman. The uterus is merely a depository for the male seed. This appears to be the view of Soranus, who defines conception as the prolonged hold on the seed or an embryo or embryos in the uterus from a natural cause. This theory accords with Soranus' frequent comparisons of the act of procreation to the sowing of a field. A seed is deposited, which gets nourishment from the soil or mother, but which is only being fed, not taking substance from its depository. The Stoic agricultural metaphor on intercourse, adopted by Philo and later Christian writers, reflects this theory. If a Christian writer adopted Serranos' view, as Tertullian does in The Soul, he would have reason to invest the male seed with special significance. Under the other theories, he would have had a general notion that male seed was important. But under no theory was the male seed itself equal to a man, for under no theory was it maintained that the seed already had a soul. End quote. This is significant because the Romans understood the reproductive process in terms of the sciences they had learned from the Greeks, and the Greeks were known for their skill in medicine. Case in point, the two most influential physicians in the Greco-Roman world were Serranos of Ephesus and Galen of Pergamum, both of whom died in the 2nd century AD. In terms of their understanding of the reproductive process, McLaren gives a short summary of each of their contributions to the sciences of the time. Quote, Serranos of Ephesus, a Greek physician who practiced in the time of Trajan and Hadrian, was Rome's greatest writer on gynecology. He employed the knowledge of the Alexandrian anatomists to discount the idea of the wandering womb and rejected Hippocratic ideas concerning the humors and sexual polarities. He denied that women possessed seed, while at the same time he argued against Aristotle's view that males and females were radically different. End quote. Quote, Galen of Pergamum, an attendant of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the most influential of the ancient anatomists, advanced a slightly different interpretation of intercourse. He provided essentially a synthesis of Aristotelian and Hippocratic theories concerning conception, accepting the importance of the humors and the two-seed theory of procreation. End quote. Part of the Greek understanding of reproduction was the soul. Quote, for the Greeks, nascent life had only limited rights. Philosophers taught that a male conceptus was not a rational or ensouled being until 30 days or 40 days after conception. A female not until after 80 or 90 days. Female seed, being thinner than the male, took longer to coagulate. The male fetus began to move at 3 months, the female at 4 months. The Greeks envisaged the existence of a variety of souls, nutritive for plants, sensitive for animals, rational for humans. The fetus, in moving through these various levels, could thus be viewed as alive from an early stage, but only in the same way a vegetable was. Indeed, Aristotle held that even before conception, semen and menstrual fluid had souls. The Jews expressed similar concern for the stages of embryological development, Exodus chapter 21, verse 22 and 23, calling for fines for damage to the fetus, but only after it was determined to be alive. The general view of the ancient world was that a fetus was never more than potentially human. Stoics reflected this common sentiment in regarding it as part of the mother until its birth. End quote. You will recall the views of St. Augustine and St. Jerome on early-term abortion. They were based on Aristotle's understanding of when ensoulment took place. It is oftentimes mistakenly assumed that the ancients thought that semen itself was a man, but this is not the case at all, and proof of which is the theory of ensoulment that we discussed earlier. Quote, that no classical writer literally identified semen with man is clear from a consideration of the leading theories on ensoulment. In Aristotle, a fetus becomes human 40 days after conception if the fetus is male, 90 days after conception if the fetus is female. A similar view may underlie the prescription in Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, that a woman must spend 40 days in becoming purified if she has given birth to a boy, 80 days if she has given birth to a girl. End quote. Likewise, Christians simply took the theories of pagan medicine, including reproduction, for granted. Quote, Lactantius provided, in The Workmanship of God, the fullest early Christian account of embryology. He drew on Aristotle, Varro, Cicero, and Lucretius to argue that procreation provided evidence of God's masterful plan. The two semens, drawn from both sexes, mixed, congealed, coagulated, and were finally consummated on the 40th day. The child's sex was determined by which semen was stronger. Character was determined by whether the mixed seed adhered to the right male or the left female horn of the womb. A more Aristotelian idea of conception with the emphasis on male seed was maintained by Augustine, Clement, and Jerome. End quote. But what forms of birth control and contraception were available in the ancient world? Along with coitus interruptus was the rhythm method, which St. Augustine condemned the Manichaeans for using, as it was used by those seeking to avoid procreation. Quote, Serrano's first suggestion for those seeking to avoid conception was to beware having sexual intercourse at those periods which we said were suitable for conception. By this he meant that the woman should employ a rhythm method and avoid sex during the days immediately following menstruation. Caelus Aurelianus Mustio and Oribasius concurred. End quote. This was not unique to Soranus, though, as the Hippocratic school had determined it prior, but a glimpse into the logic of Soranus is important for why the week immediately following menstruation was considered the time of fertility. Quote, the Hippocratic school had decided that the period most likely to be fertile occurred just after menstruation. Soranus held that the uterus, being congested at the time of menstruation, is well adapted for the evacuation of the blood which has flowed into it, but it is unfitted for the reception and retention of the seed. A few women may conceive while menstruating, but the menstrual period is not the proper time as derived from scientific considerations. The time before menstruation was also unsuitable for conception because the uterus was already receiving material, and so would have difficulty in receiving the seed. The best time for fruitful intercourse is when menstruation is ending. This mistaken fixing of the moments of high fertility was made a basis for contraceptive advice. Indeed, the first of the several contraceptive measures which Soranus prescribes is avoidance of sexual intercourse at those periods which we said were suitable for conceptions. He was followed literally by Aetios. End quote. Other forms of birth control were used as well. Quote, use of the sterile period, precoital pessaries, postcoital exercises, and gum for the male genitals were all intended to work only contraceptively. All of the latter methods, however, did involve an attack on the sperm. Even the sterile period was supposed to be sterile because the menstrual flow would affect the seed. End quote. Furthermore, quote, the Romans appear to have employed douches. Soranus mentioned a mixture of alum and wine. The poet Marital referred to the use of seawater as a spermicide. Ovid suggested that cold water was as important to women as coitus interruptus was to men. Caelius Aurelianus recommended a mixture of brine and vinegar. End quote. Now, it is occasionally claimed that the ancient authors had a very clear idea of whether the potions they were administering were abortifacts or contraceptives, but such a view is incorrect, as Noonan states, quote, contraceptives were discriminated from abortifacients in theory. In practice, it was difficult to distinguish between the abortive and contraceptive effects of some potions, and according to the most authoritative writer, Soranus, this difficulty attended every potion he would recommend. End quote. McLaren, in his work, The History of Contraception, at 2 points in the work also notes this fact twice, first stating, quote, in the 20th century, the Western defenders of contraception have usually sought to draw a clear line between birth control and abortion. In late antiquity, such demarcations were rarely made. Given the fact that the same medicines were employed as both contraceptives and abortifacients, it was quite natural that Christians should feel no great need to discriminate one from the other. End quote. He later states, quote, the Greeks had a word for the contraceptive, atokion, whereas in Latin there existed only a vague term, venenum, which meant poison. Even so, it was not always clear whether the purpose of a brew was to prevent contraception or terminate it. End quote. But key to understanding contraception in the ancient world as well as one of the reasons some of the major Christian authors found it so revolting, is the association contraception and abortifacients, but more so contraception, had with magic. This carried over into acts enhancing fertility as well. Earlier, you will recall the statements by Saint Caesarius of Arles against contraception, but here he is speaking against the enhancement of fertility. And look at what the saint ties it to. Quote, "Therefore, those to whom God is unwilling to give children should not try to have them by means of herbs or magic signs or evil charms. It is becoming and proper, for Christians especially, not to seem to fight against the dispensation of Christ by cruel, wicked boldness. Just as women whom God wants to bear more children should not take medicines to prevent their conception, so those whom God wishes to remain sterile should desire and seek this gift from God alone. They should always leave it to divine providence, asking in their prayers that God in his goodness may deign to grant what is best for them. Those women whom God wants to bear children should take care of all that are conceived, or give them to someone else to rear. As many as they kill after they are already conceived or born, before the tribunal of the eternal judge will they be held guilty of so many murders. If women attempt to kill the children within them by evil medicines, and themselves die in the act, they become guilty of 3 crimes on their own: suicide, spiritual adultery, and murder of the unborn child. Therefore, women do wrong when they seek to have children by means of evil drugs. They sin still more grievously when they kill the children who are already conceived or born, and when by taking impious drugs to prevent conception, they condemn in themselves the nature which God wanted to be fruitful. Let them not doubt that they have committed as many murders as the number of the children they might have begotten." End quote. On the quotations from St. Caesarius of Arles, Noonan comments, "Perhaps the most striking aspect of these 3 sermons is that the hostility to using herbs to cure sterility appears as keen as the hostility to their use to prevent fecundity. Birth is in God's hands. It would be, I think, a mistake to view this approach as primarily an antipathy to artificial intervention of any sort in the life-giving process. It is chiefly an opposition to magical means. The herbs were condemned as the stock in trade of pagan magicians. Their pagan character was objectionable, whatever use they were put to. Contraception fell under this rubric of magic, although it was not solely as magic that it was condemned." End quote. Nowhere is this suspicion seen more clearly than in the term pharmakeia. Now it appears twice in the New Testament. The first time is in the book of Galatians, chapter 5, verse 20, where it is typically translated as witchcraft or sorcery. As we can see, even in the traditional Catholic translation, the Douay Rheims, it is translated as witchcrafts. Quote, "Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are fornication, uncleanness, immodesty, luxury, idolatry, witchcraft, enmities, contentions, emulations, wraths, quarrels, dissensions, sects." End quote. The second time it appears in the New Testament is in the book of Revelation, chapter 18, verse 23, and there it is also typically translated as witchcraft or sorcery. The Douay Rheims translates it as enchantments, stating, quote, "And the light of the lamp shall shine no more at all in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for all nations have been deceived by thy enchantments." End quote. We see it again in the Didache, in which it is translated again in terms of magic. Quote, "You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not commit pederasty. You shall not commit fornication. You shall not steal. You shall not practice magic. You shall not practice witchcraft. You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is begotten." End quote. The second time it appears in the Didache, it says, quote, "And the way of death is this. First of all, it is evil and full of curse, murders, adulteries, lusts, fornications, thefts, idolatries, magic arts, witchcrafts, rapines, false witnessings, hypocrisies." End quote. The word appears in the Septuagint in such places as Exodus chapter 7, verse 11, Exodus chapter 7, verse 22, and Exodus chapter 8, verse 18, as well as in Isaiah chapter 47, verse 9, and Isaiah chapter 47, verse 12, to name but a few. And in those places, it is translated as sorceries or enchantments by Douay Rheims, and there is a very good reason for this. The term had to do with magical potions, not actual medicine as we would think of it. Quote, "Use of nature as a standard to measure licentiousness is not unconnected with a distrust of magic, including an aversion to pharmakeia, the use of drugs ordinarily associated with magic. Writing against the licentious members of the community in Galatians, and probably using a standard list of moral failings, Paul denounces their licentiousness, then pharmakeia. Similarly, Apocalypse chapter 9, verse 22, describing the sinners who were not saved, says, "And they did not repent of their murders, or of their pharmakeia, or of their immorality, or of their thefts." In Apocalypse chapter 21, verse 8, the pharmakoi, those who practice pharmakeia, are condemned by the Lord after he condemns fornicators. "Outside the heavenly city," says Apocalypse chapter 22, verse 15, "are the dogs and the pharmakoi, and the fornicators, and the murderers, and the idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices falsehood." There is only one other passage in the New Testament where pharmakoi or pharmakeia appears. This is in Apocalypse chapter 18, verse 23, describing the fall of Babylon, who by her pharmakeia had led astray all the nations of the earth. Here magic is clearly meant. In every other case, to translate the term as magic, sorcery, or witchcraft, as is commonly done in English translations such as the Douay, King James, Goodspeed, and Catholic Confraternity translations, is to resolve an ambiguity inherent in the meaning. As the discussion in Chapter 1 indicated, pharmaca embraces potions used to effect life or birth. The Vulgate preserved the ambiguity by translating pharmakeia as beneficia, and pharmakoi as benefici. The roughly contemporary usage by Plutarch in Romulus 22 shows that pharmakeia in respect to children was an idea familiar to the Greeks. We cannot now resolve the ambiguity, but can only conclude that the New Testament in these passages does record a hostility to medicine and medicine men. Whether this hostility is based on pagan magical association of the drugs or on their purpose as well cannot be apodictically determined. Although pharmakeia covers drugs, one can contend that it includes contraceptive potions only if one assumes that the early Christians regarded such potions as evil. There were a vast variety of potions used to kill, to make a man love, or to make a man hate. There was, moreover, a sense in which pharmakon could mean a helpful drug. In chapter 20 of his celebrated letter to the Ephesians, St. Ignatius of Antioch spoke of the community breaking the one bread, which is the pharmakon of immortality. There is, in short, good medicine and bad medicine. One cannot tell from the condemnations of pharmakeia presented in the New Testament whether only certain of the drugs used for evil purposes were condemned, whether all were condemned, or whether a contraceptive potion fell within the category of bad medicine. End quote. So we see that the term pharmakeia meant something along the lines of magic potions or medicine in the form of a spiritual healer. This is compounded by the fact that to the common person, legitimate medicine and actual magic were indistinguishable. Quote, "The close association of magic and contraceptives should be remarked. The herb potions were rational methods of achieving control of fertility in the sense that there could be a causal relation between the properties of the herbs and the consequences of the female reproductive system. But the herbs were the special resources of the magicians. The homeopathic basis of a number of the potions, the sterile willow causes sterility, sterile iron causes sterility, is one of the oldest forms of magic. The distinction we would make between amulets and potions was one which would occur only to a highly sophisticated writer like Soranus. In popular estimation, the herbal potions seemed as mysterious and magical in their effect as any amulet. End quote. But even as the piously Catholic and rigidly obedient Noonan points out, one would expect condemnations of contraception on a level similar to abortion. Quote, the medicine, rejected by the Didache and Barnabas, may be rejected by them because of its association with magic or with fornication. There is no indication in them, any more than in the New Testament, that contraceptive drugs are specifically meant, while they condemn abortion with some explicitness. Indeed, the comparison with the testimony on abortion is especially striking. The condemnations there are many and clear. They are express and direct, not in passing or inferential. The act is often condemned on its own account, not just as an adjunct to fornication. Several of the condemnations occur in documents meant to teach the faithful. There is church legislation against the act. The penalties involved, exclusion from communion for life or for 10 years, establish that the sin was regarded as a serious one, depriving the sinner of his right to be with the community. If abortion is so often castigated and contraception so little, contraception cannot have been regarded generally as a major offense against God. On the other hand, when writers do refer to contraception as evil, they do so with an evident air of introducing no novelty, of expecting acceptance of their criticism. Abortion could have seemed a more obvious evil to attack, even if an equally strong view of contraception were held. End quote. Finally, the commission set up by Pope Paul VI reported back that it could not find enough patristic evidence to go forward with a ban on contraceptives, which is why Paul VI simply ignored them and pushed Humanae Vitae through. Whether that commission was telling the truth or not is beyond the scope of this video, but what is known is that Casti Connubii and Humanae Vitae ended up having to rely not on patristic arguments to bolster usage of natural family planning, but rather had to turn to natural law. There are two main issues with natural law, though. The first, as indicated by Noonan, is that it turns into a version of the story, The Emperor's New Clothes, because whenever nature does not behave according to one's ideal, it is simply attributed to the fallen nature, while those examples that behave according to one's preconceived notions of how they should behave are held up as being true nature. Even on this account, as we saw earlier, natural family planning fails the test of how the patristic writers, who did comment on contraception and the purpose of marriage, typically understood the purpose of sex as they used the argument from natural law to condemn sex when it was infertile, something both Casti Connubii and Humanae Vitae encourage as a means of birth control. The second issue, and it is discussed in depth by Dr. David Bradshaw in his paper, What Does It Mean to Be Contrary to Nature?, is that prior to the 13th century, arguments based on natural law typically had the built-in assumption that there was a deity that had ordained the usages. Quote, the ancient argument, at least as advanced by Plato, frankly avows its confidence in some form of divine governance of nature. The details are left sketchy and no doubt varied greatly from one author to another. Nonetheless, all were confident that nature reflects the wisdom and providence of God or the gods. Accordingly, they assumed that the evident natural ordering of the sexual organs, their key and lock quality, so to speak, can be taken as a reliable guide to how they are to be used. The natural law argument found in authors like Fesser also looks to this natural ordering, but it does so without reference to a divine origin. Instead, it attempts to substitute the idea that each natural faculty has an Aristotelian telos, possessing intrinsic normative force. As I have argued, this idea leads to absurd results, and it is an alien graft upon Aristotelian ethics, which does not allot to each bodily faculty a separate ethically normative telos. End quote. In other words, a tortured version of Aristotle's ethics is not a substitute for arguments that assume a purpose with a divine origin. That is not saying Thomists deny there is a creator. It is simply saying the classic natural law arguments they use do not seem to build their arguments in reference to a divine origin, as Bradshaw states. Building off of that, one might find a third issue with the natural law argument when applied to contraception. While individual acts themselves are not always ordered towards procreation, the relationship still is. In conclusion, there was no consensus on birth control amongst the Church Fathers. Very few of them sought to comment on it, while nearly all of those who did comment on it tied it closely to magic, while simultaneously condemning sex during infertile periods, whether those be due to the menstrual cycles, pregnancy, prior to weaning a child, old age, etc. In addition, based on the plethora of canons forbidding and condemning abortion, homosexuality, bestiality, incest, masturbation, and adultery, one would assume we would see similar numbers of canons aimed at contraception, but we don't, save for a single local council in France in the 6th century that, to our knowledge, was never adopted by a larger council. In closing, we would like to thank you for your generous support that allows us to continue creating these videos and at regular intervals. We could not do it without you, so from all of us here at Ubi Petrus, thank you for listening,